in September, when the Gordon Head location was so overflowing that people couldn't find seats and people left without being able to get a seat, that was you. So we decided, okay, we're going to have to do 2 locations in Saanich, which makes sense. But after having done one in Gordon Head just in, I think it was January 8th, and the second one at Gateway Baptist, I was thinking that we might not have a full house here because people had had their chance to come. Well, this is fantastic because obviously, and I think Craig isn't kidding when he's suggesting maybe next time. But anyway, so now it's 9 locations in the riding twice a year. So we will be probably using the same 2 locations again. And the rhythm of it that seems to make sense is to present what happens in the winter to spring session of Parliament, which takes me to the end of June, that the House is sitting. We usually report on that right after Labor Day, and then the fall session report during the January recess. So the House is now in recess. We've been in recess since towards the end of December. And what I want to report to you about tonight is everything that's happened since the last town hall that we held in the Saanich area right after Labor Day. Now, as you may recall, we didn't go back to Parliament when we were expected to go back. We were expected to return to Parliament in mid-September, but Stephen Harper prorogued the House, and we went back in mid-October. So with the prorogation, I found more, suddenly I had empty days on my calendar. That never happens. So while my weekends were booked, my weekdays opened up, and I just continued with town hall meetings. I took a town hall democracy tour to 17 locations, got to most Canadian provinces, 7 provinces, and the Yukon, and in places from Dawson City to Fredericton, did democracy town halls across Canada. So that was I thought it was a good way to use the time when the House was shut down, speaking of democracy. So back to Ottawa in time for, we resumed in Parliament with a speech from the throne the week after the Wednesday following Thanksgiving. The major news in the speech from the throne was the agreement in principle for the Comprehensive Economic Trade Agreement. This is the agreement between Canada and the European Union, the text of which is still not available. So if you're interested in what we think is in it, I can certainly try to address that, but the text is still not available to parliamentarians. After the other things that in the speech from the throne were not really very surprising, but the legislative agenda immediately rolled out, and as has become, some conservative members of Parliament refer to this as if it's a tradition of Parliament. It's only a very recent tradition of Stephen Harper, so it's not a traditional parliamentary process that we get 2 omnibus budget bills. A spring omnibus budget bill and a fall omnibus budget bill. And what that means is that for every budget of 2012 and budget of 2013, those are the only 2 years in which this has ever happened in the history of Canada. Didn't happen in 2011, by the way. But you end up with essentially a cumulative total of about 800 to 900 pages of legislation which is claimed to be required to put forward the budget. And that's not actually the case. A lot of the legislation that's thrown in these omnibus bills, omnibus basically coming from the idea of Latin for everything at once. And so the spring omnibus budget bill was to the budget of 2013. The fall omnibus budget bill was Bill C4, which we dealt with this fall. It really had, if it had any theme, it was taking aim at collective bargaining rights of civil service organizations. It had a few extraneous items, reducing, for instance, under the Canada Labour Act, changing the definition of dangerous so that it becomes much harder to refuse dangerous work. So again, a labor implication. There were provisions to sell off one large area of British Columbia, which the assets, by the way, that Jim Flaherty, our finance minister, is committed to making sure that we're out of deficit, the deficit created by the stimulus spending that was required to the 2008 economic crisis. So to get out of deficit by 2015, which is the Harper administration's target, one of the things they're doing is selling off Canadian assets. So you may have noted that, for instance, selling off Canada House in London, selling off some of the embassies that we've had around the world. those asset sales don't require a bill in Parliament. But this interesting one that was in Bill C4 is something called the Dominion Coal Lands, and it was several tens of thousands of hectares in southeastern British Columbia, in the area of the Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. These were lands that were tied up through legislation back at the time of the building of the railway. So it was the Crow's Nest Pass Act that we had to amend to allow them to sell off lands that will be used for coal mining in southeastern BC. So there are some ecological concerns with that one. There were also legislation, I put forward amendments to all of the bills, of course, including a Copyright Act, First Nations Elections Act, a cluster munitions bill. But one of the things that happened this fall that was really difficult for me personally is that, and to back up, this is parliamentary procedure, and I'll try to keep it from being boring, but this is parliamentary procedure. And the significance of it was, a lot of you will know that I was able to put forward amendments at report stage in the House of Commons on every bill, particularly on Bill C-38, which was the omnibus budget bill of spring 2012, which was hugely damaging to our Fisheries Act and destroyed our environmental assessment legislation. And I put forward 400 amendments on that. And the Conservatives didn't like that I did that. And it's the first time in the history of Canada, it's sort of a backhanded compliment, if I think of it this way, that a majority parliament of a powerful party, the Conservatives, decided to take aim at one single MP to destroy my rights to put forward amendments at report stage. So in that sense, it's a compliment. But what they did was they had in individual committees, all the committees of Parliament that resumed right after the prorogation that deal with legislation, simultaneously had motions put forward by Conservative members of Parliament that were identical. So the fiction here was that each of these members came up with their own motion independent of the others, but the language was identical. And what it said was that anytime there was legislation with amendments coming forward, 48 hours before the committee moved to clause by clause review of the legislation, members of Parliament who were part of parties, such as the Green Party with fewer than 12 seats, the Bloc Québécois, or independents, would be, quote-unquote, invited to submit amendments to committee. This is a way of getting around the fact that my right to submit amendments in the House of Commons as a whole, specifically because people in my situation are MPs in parties with fewer than 12 members, are not allowed to be members of committees. So they've created what's essentially not an invitation, but an experience of coercion, that if I don't show up to committee with my amendments, I won't have an opportunity to put forward amendments at report stage. If I do show up at committee with my amendments, they just go through a ritual slaughter before the committee, and I still can't put them forward at report stage. But it's worth the fight to bring forward good amendments. So I'm now, actually, it's had the effect of increasing my workload, because I have to run from committee to committee. Sometimes they're meeting at around the same time, and it's very difficult to show up with the amendments and get them heard. I'm allowed 60 seconds per amendment to describe my amendment, and then I'm, depending on the committee chair, I'm generally not allowed to defend them or explain them or even respond to an MP who wants to make a friendly amendment to one of my amendments. So that was a big change this fall, but I did continue to put forward amendments to every piece of federal legislation. And surprisingly, on the cluster munitions bill, the opposition parties collectively, and we worked quite well together, the Liberals, the New Democrats, and Greens, to amend what was, well, backing up again, as you can imagine, a bill before the House of Commons to implement a global treaty on cluster munitions is for the purpose of getting rid of cluster munitions. So the treaty that Canada has signed, but which we have not yet ratified, said that Canada would not use or transport or acquire or develop cluster munitions. The problem with the act to implement this was that it said, but if Canada happens to be in a joint military action with an ally that has not ratified the cluster munitions bill, then any armed force member can use, transport, whatever, cluster munitions. So I was very pleased, and it's rare, it's so rare to have an amendment during the committee process, the current administration, unlike previous administrations in all of Canada's parliamentary history, doesn't actually use the legislative process before committees to amend and improve legislation, such as Bill C-38, which I just mentioned, the Omnibus Budget Bill of Spring 2012, from first reading to royal assent, did not have a single change made in over 440 pages of legislation. It's quite anomalous to Canada's parliamentary history. We have, of course, the whole point of Parliament is to actually review legislation, as well as, of course, control the public purse, which Parliament no longer does. But it's the core of parliamentary process that you amend legislation as it comes forward. In any case, we did succeed in the Cluster Munitions Bill in saying that although Canadian Armed Forces can be involved with other armed forces that are using cluster munitions, we removed the provision that said that Canadian Armed Forces themselves could use them. So at least it was an unsatisfactory compromise, but it was better than nothing. The other thing that happened this fall that you might be interested in that I did was I went to the global climate negotiations. This time, as anyone who follows the climate issue will know that under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, there is a global negotiated process every single late fall, generally in the latter half of November, sometimes creeping into December. And the purpose of that is to find a global binding treaty that will actually reduce greenhouse gases effectively. I try to go to these. I was the only member of Parliament to go this time, other than the Minister of Environment, Elizaebth. And I went there thinking I was going to be registered as essentially an observer, which gets you in the main room, but doesn't get you in most of the side negotiations where the real negotiations happen. And after arrival in Warsaw, where this is the 19th conference of the parties that took place in Warsaw, after arrival in Warsaw, and I had my credentials as an observer, but they don't get you in the real negotiations, they get you in the plenary sessions. And what you want to get the real negotiation is a bright pink line on your badge with the name of a country. Now, I did ask Canada if I could please go as a member of the Canadian delegation. And after I was already in Warsaw was when I got the response from Elizaebth saying no, they were only bringing people on the negotiated group, the official delegation would only include people who were valuable to the delegation because they knew something about climate. Anyway, but after I got to Warsaw, of all things, I was approached by the Afghanistan delegation. So some of you may know, I ended up being a member of the Afghanistan delegation. I wasn't sure what to do about it, really, because I have criticisms of the Karzai government. But the reality of the negotiations is that there was an Australian academic, a PhD in climate policy from a university in Australia, who was trying to help this little delegation. There were 3 Afghan nationals, the deputy minister of their environment department, someone from foreign affairs in Afghanistan, and somebody who was directing the climate policy. And we don't think about it much. Here's Afghanistan's trying to put together, in the last 10 years alone, their whole environmental policy, all their laws, their climate policy, and they're saying, look, we're being affected by climate change, we need to be part of the solution. And they also, the weird thing about UN negotiations is that when you go into these side rooms, despite the fact that they're in the plenary, you can get translation into 8 languages. As soon as you go in the side room where real negotiations are happening, it's all in English. And only 1 out of the 3 Afghan members of the delegation actually spoke sufficiently strong English to participate. So not to get too much detail on that, but the negotiations were quite difficult, not anywhere near as productive as they need to be, because this ongoing process, and believe me, there's a lot of room for criticizing the process in a multilateral context to get to a climate treaty, but I believe it's important. I mean, I think it's critical that we use every process we can find. The deadline for a new global treaty, including everybody, is for 2015 at what will be COP21 in Paris. So I have a different reaction to the news of Hollande's infidelity. All I'm thinking about is if his coalition falls apart, what happens to the December 2015 climate negotiations in Paris? because that's where they're going to be. Right now, by the way, in Hollande's coalition, the Minister of Development is a Green Party member from France, and that's giving us some good, from my position, given my party in global negotiations, it gives us some good access and inside information on how things are going in negotiations. Anyway, I've gone on too long about Warsaw. We then, back in Parliament for another week after the climate negotiations ended. We adjourned on a Tuesday night, so 2 days early adjournment. I thought, well, I didn't see any reason not to adjourn because nothing that we were about to pass was other than bad legislation. So I agreed to early adjournment. And then the next morning was when Canada Post made its announcements. And the Canada Post situation has come up in all the town hall meetings so far. There was one other thing this fall that I worked on, is I managed to negotiate when we were negotiating adjournment early in June, that I would only agree to early adjournment in June if members of Parliament in my situation, again, the smaller parties and a cluster of independents, were given the right to participate as sharing a committee seat on the investigation of a very unusual body called the Board of Internal Economy. The Board of Internal Economy is made up of representatives of the larger parties, right now the Liberals, the New Democrats, and the Conservatives, and they're the ones who make all the decisions about things like publication of MP expenses, how we run Parliament Hill. All of those things are basically, I think of it as a star chamber. There's no minutes of their meetings, you don't have any input to their decisions if you're not one of the larger parties. So we actually did participate and wrote a dissent to this report of the Committee on Parliamentary Procedures and Affairs, and it was a very good exercise and worked really well. Imagine I ended up sort of being the facilitator of a process to get the input from the Bloc Québécois and from a handful of independents. Oh, and then the other thing I should mention, of course, is after adjournment we also had the decision of the Joint Review Panel, the National Energy Board. I know that might want to be under discussion tonight. So that's a quick report on a survey of what was a shorter than usual parliamentary session, running from mid-October to mid-December. We resume in Parliament a week from today, and of course we'll be looking at the budget. But one of the most exciting things that happened in that brief period of mid-October to mid-December came from a backbencher Conservative, and I'm mentioning it because I'm quite encouraged and I really hope his bill will pass. His private member's bill will come up for vote right before my private member's bill for a national Lyme disease strategy comes up. You may have seen it in the media, but a really wonderful Conservative named Michael Chong, who's the Member of Parliament for Wellington Halton Hills, has put forward a very good bill that he calls the Reform Act to reduce the power of leaders of federal political parties, to increase the power of backbencher members of Parliament within a caucus, and his bill would remove, which is something I've supported for a long time, remove the requirement under the Elections Act that the leader of every party sign the nominations for every one of their candidates. This gives the leader of a party the ability to threaten their candidates and their MPs and say, well, if you don't do what I say, I'm not going to sign your nomination papers. This is essentially the only clout and plausible threat that these guys have, other than saying, I'm going to yell at you and make your life miserable. They can do that, but this is an important legislative change, the Elections Act. And also, Michael Chong's bill would restore Canadian parliamentary democracy to more of what we have in the other Commonwealth countries. Our Westminster parliamentary system is, of course, shared with the UK and all other Commonwealth countries, but Canada's morphed in a weird way, and that's that whereas when you think of the Prime Minister in other countries in the Commonwealth can be removed by their caucus. So remember, Margaret Thatcher was removed not by a vote of the British electorate, but by her own caucus putting John Major in place instead of her. And in Australia recently it's happened twice, where Rudd was removed by Juliet Gillard, and then Juliet Gillard was removed by Rudd. Well, in Canada, only because, I think because of our proximity to the United States, we have kind of adopted some of the US political culture with the idea that the leader of the party is only elected through the convention of the members, and they've deprived parliamentary caucuses of their right to say, look, we're sick of so-and-so, we're going to put somebody else in place. So what Michael Chong's bill would do would be to restore what's essentially still in common law and gone into disuse. And his bill would say that if 15% of any caucus feels that they want to, they can trigger a leadership review in their own caucus. So it's a very strong parliamentary reform. And it wouldn't take effect until after the next election. So, but that's okay. I mean, if we can get this reform bill through, Canadian parliamentary democracy will be much healthier. And so I'm very committed to working to get it to pass. And as things now stand, I know that Michael Chong has the support. I would guesstimate, depending on how brave they feel on the day, somewhere between 20 and 40 Conservatives would vote for his bill. It is a private member's bill, and there are things that could go wrong with it between here and getting it passed. That's as much as I should say by way of an opening.